War has always depended on weapons, soldiers, and strategy. But in the 20th century, something fundamental changed. Industrial corporations became just as important to warfare as armies themselves. Factories began producing not only consumer goods, but bombers, tanks, engines, and the infrastructure of global conflict.
During the First World War, industrial production started to reshape how wars were fought. By the Second World War, entire economies were mobilized. Companies like Ford, General Motors, and Mitsubishi were no longer simply manufacturers. They had become critical components of national military capability.
And after the war ended, something even more significant happened. The relationship between governments and industry did not disappear, it became permanent.
In this episode, we explore how corporations quietly became embedded in the machinery of modern warfare and why that transformation still shapes global power today.
So I want you to just imagine the logistical reality of how wars were fought for the vast majority of human history.
Right.
Because if you look at the historical records and the imagery from our sources today, there are no sprawling assembly lines. You see stone-walled armories.
Royal arsenals.
Exactly, royal arsenals. You see local workshops with craftsmen painstakingly forging swords, shields, early firearms, all entirely by hand.
Yeah, and that concept of bespoke production is really the crucial starting point here. Before the Industrial Revolution, weapons were essentially unique pieces of craftsmanship.
Which means?
Which means if the firing mechanism on a 17th century musket broke in the field, you couldn't just order a standardized replacement part.
Right.
A blacksmith literally had to forge a new piece to fit that specific rifle.
It's wild to think about.
It is. And that lack of standardization, combined with manual production, it created a hard ceiling on the scale, the speed, and the duration of any conflict.
Because the logistics were entirely dictated by literal horsepower. When an army moved, its supply lines relied on wooden carts pulled by draft animals. Sustaining those troops depended completely on local agriculture and regional supply networks.
Yeah, foraging.
Right, so if an army outpaced its local food supply, or if that local blacksmith couldn't repair their weapons fast enough, the entire campaign stalled out. It was this logistical tether that kept wars relatively contained.
It's a very manual regional reality. I mean, while industries, in the form of mills and foundries certainly existed, it was not the underlying engine of warfare. State militaries and private economies existed in somewhat separate spheres.
They didn't really mix.
Not at scale, no. The military fought, and civilian tradesmen occasionally sold them goods. But the battlefield and the workshop were not integrated systems.
So contrast that with the imagery of 20th century warfare we have in our notes. You see massive factories with towering smokestacks dominating the skyline.
Rail yards packed with identical munitions.
Yes. Thousands of workers operating stamping presses. It's a completely different universe.
Yeah.
And it makes you wonder about the constraints of those older eras. Think about how slowly an army could move or rebuild when every single sword, musket ball, and cannon was forged by hand. How drastically would that logistical drag limit the scope of a commander's ambition? We would love to hear your thoughts on those historical limitations, so please drop them in the comments below.
And that historical limitation was absolutely shattered by the 20th century. The turning point, the absolute shock to the global system, was the First World War.
Yeah.
This is the moment where warfare ceases to be purely a tactical problem and becomes a massive industrial and economic problem. The old variables of brilliant cavalry maneuvers or the sheer bravery of troops, they were no longer enough to secure victory.
A completely new variable took precedence.
Exactly. And it was a ruthless mathematical equation. Production capacity now equaled military power.
But how does that transition actually happen? Because moving from local arsenals to that scale of mass production isn't just about, hiring more blacksmiths.
No, not at all.
The First World War forced nations to mobilize entire economies, but armies themselves didn't know how to run massive supply chains.
Precisely. The military establishments quickly realized they were entirely unequipped to manage the sheer volume of material required for this new kind of total war. The scale of destruction demanded a volume of explosives, steel, and machinery that royal arsenals could never dream of producing.
So they had to outsource it.
They had to turn to the only entities capable of managing that scale: private corporate titans. They didn't just step in to help, they effectively took over the supply chain of violence.
Let's look at the specific companies that emerged as the backbone of this effort. You have DuPont in the United States. Before the war, they were certainly a successful chemical and explosives company, but during the conflict, they scaled their chemical manufacturing to an unprecedented level.
Unprecedented.
They essentially industrialized the chemical reactions needed for smokeless powder and high explosives, turning laboratory processes into massive, continuous production loops.
And in Germany, you see Krupp operating on a similar paradigm. Krupp dominated metallurgy, steel production, and heavy weapons systems. But what made Krupp so formidable wasn't just that they made cannons.
It was their vertical integration.
Exactly. They controlled the coal mines, the iron ore, the steel mills, and the artillery factories. They created a seamless pipeline from raw earth to finished weapon.
Our sources also highlight companies like Vickers in the UK, churning out naval equipment and the machine guns that really defined trench warfare. You had BASF and Bethlehem Steel providing industrial chemicals, heavy armor plate, naval guns.
Right.
What we are seeing is the moment war stopped being fought solely by armies and started being literally manufactured by industry.
To understand the implications of that shift, we have to look at the statistics from our sources. They paint a clear picture of factories operating as strategic weapons. During the First World War, Allied nations produced over 1.5 billion artillery shells.
Let's pause on that number for a second.
That's staggering.
1.5 billion artillery shells requires a logistical choreography that is hard to even comprehend. You need the brass casings, the chemical explosives, the steel for the shrapnel, the specialized fuses, and the rail networks to move them all to the front continuously for years.
Exactly. And alongside that, over 10 million standardized rifles were mass-produced across competing industrial economies. This output fundamentally proves that the front line extended far beyond the muddy trenches of Europe. The front line began on the assembly line.
Wow, yeah.
This era also introduced entirely new classes of weapons that were completely dependent on advanced factory infrastructure. You cannot craft chlorine gas, early fighter biplanes, or armored tanks in a local workshop. These require complex, coordinated industrial output and specialized engineering.
Which brings us to the Second World War, where this concept of industrial warfare goes into absolute overdrive. By the 1940s, the relationship between government and industry had fundamentally transformed. The distinctions between the state, the military establishment, and the private corporation began to blur entirely.
They were merging into a single, cohesive system of total corporate mobilization.
And this is where the integration becomes just a marvel of modern engineering. Let's examine the Ford Motor Company. Our sources detail their Willow Run factory in Michigan, which was specifically built to manufacture B-24 Liberator bombers. Ford produced 8,685 of these heavy bombers.
And at their peak efficiency, they were rolling one complete bomber off the assembly line every 63 minutes.
That is an incredible metric, every 63 minutes. But I have to ask, how does an automotive company suddenly know how to build a heavy bomber? Because the engineering tolerances for an aircraft are vastly different from a Model T. Did the government just hand Ford the blueprints and hope for the best?
That was actually a massive point of friction at the time. Aviation engineers were used to building planes almost like craftsmen, fitting parts together manually, adjusting them until they worked perfectly.
The bespoke model again.
Right, the bespoke model. But Charles Sorensen, Ford's production chief, looked at that process and realized it couldn't scale. Ford demanded absolute standardization. They applied automotive stamping techniques to aviation aluminum.
Oh, that makes sense.
They insisted on interchangeable parts so precise that a wing built on Monday would perfectly fit a fuselage built on Thursday. It wasn't just about building planes. It was about re-engineering the method of building planes so that unskilled labor could assemble highly complex machines at scale.
And while they were revolutionizing aerospace, Ford was also churning out 280,000 Jeeps for the ground war. General Motors executed a similar pivot. They converted over 100 consumer factories specifically for war production. Through those retooled facilities, GM built 206,000 aircraft engines, 854,000 military trucks, and 13,000 armored vehicles.
It's just a total conversion.
Consumer economies were completely paused, and their entire productive capacities were integrated into the national military apparatus.
But the physical machinery is only half the story here. As warfare scaled globally, the logistical complexity became impossible for humans to track manually. This is where the source material brings IBM into the equation.
This is a huge shift.
It represents a massive shift. We move from the manufacturing of physical steel to the processing of data.
Because managing the deployment of millions of soldiers, tracking their boots, their rations, their ammunition, and coordinating shipping schedules across 2 oceans, A human clerical staff would take weeks to process what a battlefield commander needed to know that same day.
Which is exactly why IBM deployed punch card systems specifically for military logistics. These electromechanical machines could process millions of records for troop deployment and supply chain management in a fraction of the time.
They were essentially the earliest databases.
Precisely. We're looking at the early computational systems not just managing inventory, but also being utilized for complex mathematical tasks like code breaking and artillery targeting. The war effort required managing data just as urgently as it required stamping steel.
And we should emphasize that this was a global phenomenon. Aerospace and weapons production spanned every major combatant nation. You had Mitsubishi in Japan acting as a major naval shipbuilder and producing thousands of military aircraft, including the famous A6M-0 fighter.
You had Boeing and Lockheed in the U.S. building massive fleets of bombers and fighters.
Rolls-Royce in the UK manufacturing specialized aircraft engines. Messerschmitt in Germany building advanced interceptors, and Fiat in Italy producing aircraft and armored vehicles.
It highlights how these private, profit-driven entities were operating as direct extensions of state geopolitical power. They were nationalized in purpose, if not entirely in ownership.
It really forces you to look at your own workplace differently. If your commercial logistics or software company was suddenly drafted by the government tomorrow to track global troop movements or build defense systems, how would the nature of your daily work change? You wouldn't just be an employee anymore, you'd be a node in a defense network. Let us know in the comments how your industry would adapt. It's a fascinating thought experiment.
It is a profound shift in identity. And what makes it even more fascinating is that during the war, most citizens and politicians genuinely believed this was just a temporary state of affairs.
Right.
They assumed that once victory was achieved, the factories would simply go back to making refrigerators and family sedans.
That illusion of a temporary wartime economy is one of history's most fascinating hidden gears. If you are finding this breakdown of history's hidden gears fascinating, make sure you subscribe to our YouTube NC WebDevV channel right now. We have a lot of new stuff coming out, and you won't want to miss a single deep dive. Because what happened next wasn't a return to normal. It was a permanent structural shift.
Exactly. We have to look at the post-WWII reality to understand the world we live in today. Before the Second World War, industrial war production was historically viewed as a temporary crisis measure. Factories converted for a specific war, and when the peace treaty was signed, the government contracts dried up, and industry returned to the civilian market. Defense was an acute response, not a chronic condition.
But after 1945, that reversion to civilian life never fully happened. The geopolitical landscape shifted immediately into the Cold War. The threat of conflict was continuous, which meant war production became permanent infrastructure.
Defense contractors maintained standing capacity.
The military-industrial relationships that were forged in the emergency of WWII became institutionalized.
And this institutionalization relied heavily on new economic models, like cost-plus contracting, where the government guaranteed a profit margin above the cost of research and production. This incentivized corporations to remain in the defense sector permanently. And this transition did not go unnoticed. It was recognized at the highest levels of government as a profound structural change to society.
We actually have the exact quote from President Dwight D. Eisenhower's farewell address in January 1961, and it is chillingly prescient. He stated, and I quote, "In the councils of government, we must guard against the acquisition of unwarranted influence, whether sought or unsought, by the military-industrial complex."
Unpacking that quote is essential for understanding modern geopolitics. Eisenhower, a five-star general who commanded the Allied forces in Europe, wasn't making a casual observation. He was sounding an alarm about the permanent entanglement of the federal government, the military establishment, and private industry.
He saw the danger.
He did. He recognized that when you have massive corporations whose sole fiduciary duty is to generate profit for shareholders, and their only customer is the national security apparatus, their influence on foreign policy, defense budgets, and even political elections becomes profound. It poses a structural risk to democratic governance itself.
The players that emerged from that era, those who navigated this permanent standing defense economy, are still the titans of today. They evolved from temporary wartime suppliers into permanent strategic actors. We are talking about massive conglomerates like Lockheed Martin, Raytheon Technologies, Northrop Grumman, General Dynamics, BAE Systems, and L3 Technologies.
These corporations form the literal architecture of modern warfare. Modern military strategy is no longer built on the backs of infantry armies alone. If you analyze the structure today, every single dimension of military power rests entirely on a foundation of corporate capability.
Our sources break down exactly what that corporate infrastructure looks like. It operates essentially as a five-pillar system. The military doesn't build a fighter jet, they buy a platform. First, you have the aerospace companies, which design and fabricate the physical aircraft, drones, and missile airframes.
Second, you have the electronics manufacturers, providing the highly advanced radar arrays, targeting sensors, and precision guidance systems that go inside those airframes.
Third, you have logistics corporations. Moving troops, maintaining supply chains, and fueling fleets globally is largely managed by private transport and logistics experts.
Fourth, and increasingly the most vital, are the software firms. They perform the systems integration. A modern jet is essentially a flying data center, and these firms write the code that makes the sensors talk to the weapons, while also providing the cybersecurity to protect the entire network.
And the fifth pillar consists of the communications providers, who launch and manage the satellites and encrypted networks that allow a commander in one hemisphere to operate a drone in another.
When you look at those five pillars, it means conceptually that the fundamental nature of the battlefield has shifted. Yes, the uniformed soldier executes the mission on the battlefield, but the corporation designs the weapon, writes the software, builds the platform, and often maintains it in the field.
The geography of the battlefield has expanded.
It has. It's no longer just a contested valley or a strategic coastline. The battlefield now intrinsically includes the manufacturing plants, the data centers, the satellites in orbit, and the software running the communications networks.
They are not just the support structures for the war machine. As our sources clearly emphasize, they are the war machine. Private industry built it, they provided the factories, the contractors, and the sustained innovation year after year. And by the 1960s, these industrial corporations were fully embedded partners in global military power.
But just as that heavy industrial system cemented itself, the nature of strategic competition shifted drastically with the escalation of the Cold War. And this is where the limitations of pure physical industry became glaringly apparent.
Right, because the defining problems of the Cold War couldn't be solved by stamping more steel or building a faster tank.
Exactly.
The military was suddenly tasked with managing a global nuclear arsenal. Intercontinental ballistic missiles travel at thousands of miles per hour. If an adversary launches a strike, you have minutes to detect it, verify the radar data, calculate the trajectory, and command a response across continents.
A human brain, or even a room full of brilliant human analysts, simply cannot do that math fast enough. Furthermore, the sheer volumes of intelligence data being collected around the world signals intelligence, radar pings, encrypted communications were staggering. Steel manufacturers and aircraft builders, no matter how efficient their assembly lines, could not solve a data processing bottleneck.
So a totally new force had to enter the theater of warfare, the technology companies. Information itself was becoming the ultimate strategic power, and processing that information required a completely different kind of corporate partner. We see the birth of massive computerized air defense networks, like the SAGE system in the 1950s, which required unprecedented computing power and telecommunications integration.
It marks a profound evolution in how we define a defense contractor. We progressed from local blacksmiths forging iron to massive corporate syndicates stamping steel and aluminum, and finally to technology firms manipulating silicon and code. The modern defense contractor is increasingly a system integrator rather than just a metal bender.
Which leaves us with a truly fascinating and somewhat unsettling question to mull over. If the modern battlefield relies entirely on complex software, fiber optic networks, data centers, and satellites owned and operated by private technology companies.
Then when a major conflict breaks out today, where exactly are the front lines?
Right. Are they in a traditional trench, or are they sitting on a server rack in a brightly lit corporate office building somewhere in a civilian tech hub?
It completely redefines what constitutes a legitimate military target and who is actually a combatant in a modern conflict. If a civilian tech company's cloud infrastructure hosts the military's logistics network, that cloud infrastructure is now a front line.
It fundamentally changes how we view the corporations we interact with every day. Keep questioning the systems around you, and let us know where you think the actual front line is today in the comments. Thanks for taking this journey with us, and we'll catch you on the next deep dive.